Chaos in Paris Friday night as terrorists storm public spaces, detonate bombs, and open fire.
Two blasts at the Brussels airport left behind a chaotic scene.
Muslim sect known locally as Boko Haram. In Hausa, the name means Western education is sacrilege. The group has been campaigning to implement.
The level of violence perpetrated by non-state armed groups in today's conflicts is staggering. The reach of that violence, both physically and online, is enormous. Even though the recruitment and use of children by armed groups is not a new phenomenon, it is significant in its current scale and extremity.
So prepare your army and gather your nations, for we too are preparing our army. For our meeting lies at Dabir.
Humanitarians have long worked to prevent the recruitment and use of children by armed groups, and to facilitate the release and reintegration of those who cannot avoid association. But as conflicts become more complex, and when those recruiting children are terrorist or viewed as violent extremist groups, the question arises, is our standard approach fit for purpose for addressing this scourge? To answer that question, the United Nations University, in collaboration with UNICEF, the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, and Luxembourg and Switzerland, has run a 2-year research initiative to examine the trajectories of children into and out of armed groups in contemporary conflict. Drawing from original field research in Nigeria, Mali, Syria, and Iraq, a few broad findings about child association with contemporary armed groups become clear. Children become involved with armed groups today, even those that are deemed terrorist or violent extremist, for many of the same reasons that they became involved with armed groups in previous conflicts. Child association with armed groups is not monocausal. That is to say that children are influenced by an array of interconnected structural, social, and individual factors. While there are certainly trends in and across conflicts, there is no magic cocktail. Our assumption that children can remain unaffiliated in armed conflict is deeply flawed. When children live under armed group control, or the government or their communities assume that everyone is affiliated with the enemy, neutrality may not be an option. We tend to focus on the negative reasons that children engage in armed groups, say a desire to exact revenge. But children often have primarily pro-social reasons for joining, such as love for their community or a desire to gain significance and be part of something bigger than themselves. A few of our researchers share some of their specific findings from their case studies.
Patterns of local recruitment differ significantly from transnational recruitment. Armed groups that control territory can use coercion, real-life social networks, material rewards, and institutions on the ground to apply pressure on populations in these areas. In contrast, armed groups that don't control territory need to rely on non-coercive strategies of persuasion and inducement. And these often involve virtual peer networks that operate over social media platforms, including Facebook and Telegram. Another key finding is that the Syrian civil war has created intense pressures and incentives for children to align themselves with some armed group for self-preservational reasons, and this has made neutrality impossible for many children. In areas controlled by armed groups, alignment with one of these groups is necessary for economic and physical survival. As one of my interviewees explained, many parents felt that it was necessary for at least one of their daughters to marry an Islamic State fighter as a kind of protection bargain, or in Arabic, a safqa al-himaya. In the Syrian conflict, family and social networks are an important factor, both in decisions to join a group and switch sides between different groups. For example, one boy who joined Jaish al-Islam at the age of 14 said, when asked what he would do if his relatives switched sides to a different group, "Of course I would follow them because I trust them." So while these social and family networks are an important factor in joining, they can also facilitate demobilization. For example, one former Islamic State fighter who quit the group after becoming disillusioned said he stayed in touch with friends still in the group, who later approached him for advice about escape routes when they too decided to disengage.
L'étude du cas du Mali démontre que les enfants rejoignent les groupes armés à travers le recrutement individuel, surtout des enfants vulnérables sans protection, c'est-à-dire les talibés, les enfants de la rue, et aussi à travers la mobilisation communautaire. La mobilisation communautaire est prédominante et moins visible. Pour ces cas de figure, l'enfant devient une contribution à l'effort de guerre en vue de défendre et de protéger sa communauté. Et il est peu probable que l'enfant se retire jusqu'à ce que la communauté démissionne. Il est très difficile de faire une nette distinction entre les groupes armés au Mali. Il existe environ 3 catégories, parmi lesquelles figurent les enfants et les jeunes, qui sont précédemment les groupes rebelles indépendantistes, les milices d'autodéfense, qui sont parfois pro-gouvernementales, et les djihadistes, ceux qui cherchent à imposer la charia. Cependant, il n'existe pas de frontières linéaires entre les membres de ces groupes qui sont liés par les rapports sociaux, géographiques et économiques. La radicalisation religieuse n'est pas mise en exergue dans notre étude. Les communautés expliquent les raisons du recrutement par l'injustice, la faiblesse et la corruption des agents de l'État, la pauvreté extrême, le manque d'opportunités économiques pour les jeunes, etc.
Recruitment in armed groups in Nigeria is driven by a number of factors, spanning everything from conscription to financial support to ideological affinity. Armed groups also offer non-material social incentives, such as the promise of marriage, which otherwise might be out of reach for those who can't afford to pay bride price. In Nigeria, the reasons that children become associated with armed groups are not necessarily the same as the reasons for staying within those groups. The status that they attain within the group might make it difficult for them to return to civilian life. Those displaced by Boko Haram's violence often express fear about the future and a desire for justice, and often revenge. Nevertheless, some respondents expressed a willingness to accept former members back into the community if they had been rehabilitated.
The goal of this initiative is ultimately to help child protection practitioners on the ground so they can improve the design and implementation of programs to prevent and respond to child recruitment by armed groups. As we begin to work with the practitioner community to distill these research findings into practical, actionable programmatic guidance, it is important to remember that even when the guns of war go silent, the challenges and stressors children face do not necessarily end. This is something that Kaba Williams, a former child soldier from Sierra Leone, knows all too well. He recently interviewed other former child soldiers, a decade and a half after they had been demobilized.
My name is Kaba Williams. When I was 7 years old, I was captured by the RUF and forced to fight in a war that I did not understand. I managed to escape after 6 months, only to be captured and forced to fight by the Sierra Leone Armed Forces. After almost 3 years, UNICEF facilitated my release. I am now a spokesperson for young victims of conflict, other former child soldiers from Sierra Leone, in order for me to see how are they doing with their lives after 15 years when the war ended. The child soldiers I spoke to had a difficult road to recovery. They may seem resilient not because it is in their nature, but by necessity to survive. No one is happy where they are now. They want to take the next step, but they face obstacles. They lack the network and mentors to help them overcome these challenges and find their way in society.
In light of the dynamics of child recruitment in today's conflicts, how should the international community respond? The insights of Kaba and the former child soldiers of Sierra Leone seem prescient as we strategize about how to help the children of Syria, Mali, and Nigeria.
I think the international community must realize that the reintegration of child soldiers takes time, perhaps longer than other peace-building taxes. They must respond with the right tool to help the victim of conflict, but also the community to which they will return to. Former child soldiers should be given a stronger voice in the reintegration decision-making process so that they can contribute to their own recovery.
Ultimately, to end child association with armed groups, we must create peaceful, prosperous, and inclusive societies where children do not need to rely on armed groups for their basic needs or their self-worth. As we turn our attention to translating these research findings into concrete guidance for practitioners, it is important to reflect on the experiences of people like Kaba to ensure that we create long-term, flexible, and inclusive programming to support war-affected children and youth. Ultimately, they represent the generation that will help ensure sustainable peace.